June 4, 1942. The island of Akutan, part of the Aleutian chain stretching westward from Alaska, lay shrouded in dense fog as Flight Petty Officer First Class Tadayoshi Koga brought his Mitsubishi, a 6M2 Type 0 carrier fighter, into what he believed would be a routine emergency landing. The engine of his aircraft coughed and sputtered, damaged during the attack on Dutch Harbor just hours earlier. Below him, what appeared to be a flat, grassy field seemed like salvation. He had no way of knowing that this single decision, made in desperation at an altitude of less than 300 meters, would hand the United States the most valuable intelligence prize of the entire Pacific conflict. Koga believed he would walk away from this landing, repair his aircraft and rejoin his squadron within days. He could not have been more catastrophically wrong. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What followed was a chain of events that would transform the Invincible Zero from Japan's greatest aerial advantage into a solved puzzle, turning the tide of the air war in the Pacific and ultimately contributing to the collapse of Japanese air superiority across the entire theater of operations. The morning had begun with confidence bordering on arrogance. Koga, 24 years old, and a veteran of campaigns over China and the early Pacific offensives, had launched from the aircraft carrier Ryujo as part of a strike force targeting American installations at Dutch Harbor in the Aleutians. The diversionary operation, timed to coincide with the main Japanese assault on Midway Island, was intended to draw American forces northward and create confusion about Japanese intentions. The Zero fighters escorting the bombers had encountered minimal resistance, and Koga's aircraft had performed flawlessly until a stray round from ground-based defensive fire punctured his oil line. The damage was not immediately catastrophic. The Sakai 12 radial engine, producing over 900 horsepower, continued to function despite the steady loss of lubricant. But Koga, trained in the careful conservation of his aircraft, knew that continuing to fly risked complete engine seizure. His squadron mates, Flight Petty Officers Tsugo Shikada and Yoshimi Maeda, maintained formation with him as he descended toward Akutan Island. Standard procedure dictated that they would circle overhead while he attempted an emergency landing, then guide him back to the carrier once repairs were made, or destroy the aircraft if recovery proved impossible. The island below appeared uninhabited. Intelligence briefings had mentioned no American presence on Akutan, and the terrain looked manageable. What Koga saw as a suitable landing field was actually a marsh covered with thick tundra grass, its surface concealing soft, wet earth that would prove as deadly as any enemy fire. At approximately 11:15 in the morning local time, Koga committed to his approach. The Zero touched down at just over 100 kilometers per hour, its landing gear compressing as expected. Then, in an instant, everything went wrong. The wheels sank deep into the hidden marsh. The aircraft's nose pitched forward violently. The propeller struck the ground and shattered. The force of the deceleration threw Koga forward against his restraints with such violence that his neck snapped instantly. The aircraft flipped inverted, coming to rest upside down in the soggy tundra, its fuselage relatively intact, but its pilot deceased in the cockpit. Circling overhead, Shikada and Maeda watched in horror. They could see the overturned aircraft, but could not determine Koga's condition. Standard operating procedure was clear. If recovery was impossible, they were to strafe the downed Zero to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. But here the story takes its first critical turn. The two pilots, seeing no signs of fire and believing their comrade might still be alive inside the cockpit, could not bring themselves to open fire on their friend. They circled for nearly 30 minutes, burning precious fuel, hoping to see Koga emerge from the wreckage. Maeda would later write in his personal account that the decision not to destroy the aircraft haunted him for the rest of his life. He radioed that Koga appeared to have survived the landing and might be injured but alive. The two pilots, their fuel running critically low, finally broke off and returned to the Ryujo, reporting that Koga had made an emergency landing and would require pickup. The carrier, however, was already steaming southward at maximum speed, having received word of the devastating Japanese defeat at Midway. The operation in the Aleutians had achieved its tactical objectives, but had become strategically irrelevant. No rescue mission for a single pilot would be authorized. Koga's Zero, tail number A1-154, lay inverted and forgotten on a desolate island in the North Pacific. 5 weeks passed before the aircraft was discovered by an American patrol. A United States Navy PBY Catalina flying boat, conducting routine reconnaissance over the Aleutian Chain on July 10th, spotted the unusual shape partially hidden in the marsh grass. The crew radioed the sighting, describing what appeared to be a downed Japanese fighter in remarkably intact condition. The report generated immediate interest at naval headquarters in Alaska. Lieutenant William N. Leonard, a naval aviator and intelligence officer stationed at Dutch Harbor, received orders to investigate. Leonard, 31 years old and a graduate of the Naval Academy class of 1933, understood immediately what the discovery might represent. The Zero had acquired an almost mythical reputation among Allied pilots. It could outmaneuver any fighter the Americans had in service. It possessed an extraordinary range that seemed to defy the laws of physics and fuel consumption. It climbed faster, turned tighter, and operated at altitudes where American aircraft struggled to maintain performance. Allied pilots had developed tactics based on assumptions and guesswork, trying to compensate for aircraft that were fundamentally outmatched in aerial combat. But no one in the American military had been able to conduct a thorough technical analysis of an intact Zero. The Japanese had been meticulous about denying the Allies this opportunity. Pilots were under strict orders to destroy their aircraft rather than allow capture. Ground crews set fire to damaged Zeros rather than abandon them to advancing enemy forces. The few examples that had fallen into Allied hands were so damaged as to be useless for evaluation. Leonard assembled a recovery team that included mechanics, engineers, and additional security personnel. On July 11th, they reached Akutan Island by seaplane, landing in the protected waters of a nearby bay. What they found exceeded their most optimistic expectations. The Zero sat inverted, its wings slightly crumpled, its landing gear collapsed, but its fuselage essentially intact. More critically, the engine, instruments, weapons systems, and control surfaces were all present and appeared functional. The impact had been violent enough to prove fatal for the pilot, but gentle enough to preserve the aircraft's essential components. The recovery team worked with extreme care, aware that a single mistake could render the discovery worthless. They carefully excavated around the aircraft, documenting everything with photographs and detailed notes. Koga's body was removed and buried with military honors, a gesture that Leonard insisted upon despite some objections from crew members who questioned showing respect to an enemy combatant. Leonard would later state that the pilot had given America an involuntary gift of incalculable value, and he deserved to be treated with dignity. The Zero was disassembled, crated, and transported to Dutch Harbor, then shipped to Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego, California. It arrived on August 12, 1942, accompanied by Leonard and a team of specialists who had handled every step of its journey. The Office of Naval Intelligence designated the aircraft as Project Zero, assigning it the highest priority classification. The restoration team, led by engineers from the Naval Aircraft Factory and civilian contractors from North American Aviation, worked around the clock. They manufactured replacement parts for damaged components, consulting Japanese technical manuals that had been captured in earlier operations. The landing gear was repaired and reinforced. A new propeller was fabricated to match the original specifications. The engine, cleaned and carefully reassembled, was test-fired on September 20th. It ran smoothly, its distinctive sound recorded for later use in training American pilots to identify enemy aircraft by engine note alone. On September 24, 1942, test pilot Lieutenant Commander Eddie R. Sanders climbed into the cockpit of Koga's Zero for the first time. Sanders, a veteran naval aviator with over 2,000 flight hours in dozens of different aircraft types, had been specifically selected for his analytical flying skills and his ability to evaluate aircraft performance with precision. He was accompanied by a chase plane flown by Lieutenant Colonel Fred Trapnell, another highly experienced test pilot who would observe the Zero's performance from an external perspective. Sanders advanced the throttle, and the Sakai engine responded instantly. The aircraft accelerated down the runway with startling quickness, lifting off after a ground roll of less than 200 meters. What happened over the next 90 minutes would fundamentally alter American fighter tactics and design philosophy for the remainder of the conflict. Sanders pushed the Zero through every maneuver he could conceive. He climbed at full power, reaching 6,000 meters in just under 7 minutes, a rate that exceeded the capabilities of the American F-4F Wildcat by a substantial margin. He threw the aircraft into tight turns, pulling maximum G-forces, and was astonished to find that the Zero could sustain a turning radius that seemed physically impossible. At lower speeds, it could complete a full 360-degree turn in just over 14 seconds, a performance figure that no American fighter could approach. But Sanders was not simply enjoying the aircraft's strengths. He was methodically probing for weaknesses, and he found them in abundance. The Zero's exceptional maneuverability came at a tremendous cost. The airframe was lightly built, sacrificing structural strength and pilot protection for weight savings that enhanced performance. There was no armor plating behind the pilot's seat. The fuel tanks were not self-sealing, meaning that even a few rounds of ammunition could cause catastrophic fires. The aircraft's controls became heavy and unresponsive at speeds above 450 kilometers per hour, making it vulnerable in high-speed diving attacks. Most critically, Sanders discovered that the Zero's roll rate, the speed at which it could rotate around its longitudinal axis, was surprisingly poor, especially at higher speeds. This meant that an American pilot, if caught in a disadvantageous position, could potentially escape by rolling inverted and diving away at full throttle, using superior speed and dive performance to break contact before the Zero could follow. Over the following weeks, Sanders and other test pilots flew the Zero more than 50 times, accumulating detailed performance data across its entire flight envelope. They tested it against every American fighter then in service: the F-4F Wildcat, the P-38 Lightning, the P-39 Airacobra, and the new F-4U Corsair then entering production. The engineers recorded every measurement: climb rates at different altitudes, turn radii at various speeds, acceleration characteristics, fuel consumption rates, maximum dive speeds, and structural limitations. The results were compiled into a comprehensive technical report that ran to over 300 pages. But the most valuable output was a much shorter document, a tactical bulletin distributed to every fighter squadron in the Pacific Fleet. It was written in plain language, avoiding technical jargon, and it provided specific, actionable guidance for American pilots facing the Zero in combat. The bulletin's recommendations were revolutionary in their directness. "Do not attempt to turn with a Zero at low or medium speeds," it stated unequivocally. "The Zero will outturn any American fighter currently in service. Instead, use diving attacks from superior altitude. Build up speed in the dive, make a single firing pass, and continue the dive to escape, using your superior speed to open distance. Do not climb away from a Zero at low speeds. It will catch you. If caught in a disadvantageous position, roll inverted and dive at maximum throttle. The Zero's poor roll rate at high speeds will prevent it from following effectively." The bulletin also addressed the Zero's vulnerabilities in stark terms. The aircraft is extremely fragile. A short burst of .50 caliber machine gun fire will often cause critical structural failure or fuel fires. Aim for the fuselage and wings. The pilot has no armor protection. The fuel tanks will ignite easily. What American pilots had seen as an invincible opponent was, in reality, a highly specialized aircraft that sacrificed everything for maneuverability and range. It was a brilliant design for the early war period, when Japanese pilots were highly trained and could use superior skill to avoid situations that exposed the Zero's weaknesses. But as the conflict continued and Japan lost its experienced pilots, those weaknesses became catastrophic. The tactical revolution that followed the evaluation of Koga's Zero cannot be overstated. American fighter squadrons in the Pacific abandoned their attempts to dogfight with Japanese aircraft on equal terms. Instead, they adopted what became known as boom and zoom tactics, maintaining altitude advantage, making high-speed diving attacks, and refusing to be drawn into low-speed turning engagements. Squadron commanders drilled their pilots relentlessly on the new procedures, using the performance data from the captured Zero to demonstrate exactly when and how to engage. The impact on combat results was immediate and dramatic. In the 6 months following the distribution of the tactical bulletin, American kill ratios against Japanese fighters improved from roughly 1-to-1 to better than 3-to-1 in favor of American pilots. As new American fighters entered service, designs that emphasized speed, diving performance, and structural strength over turning ability, the advantage increased further. The F-6F Hellcat, which entered service in early 1943, was specifically designed with the Zero's weaknesses in mind. It could not outturn a Zero, but it was faster in level flight and in dives. It could absorb tremendous battle damage, and it carried sufficient firepower to destroy a Zero with brief firing opportunities. By mid-1943, American pilots no longer feared the Zero. They respected it as a capable aircraft that remained dangerous in the hands of a skilled pilot. But the aura of invincibility had been completely shattered. Japanese naval aviation, which had begun the conflict with the best-trained carrier pilots in the world and the most advanced carrier fighter, found itself increasingly outmatched by American pilots, flying aircraft specifically designed to exploit Japanese weaknesses. The intelligence value of Koga's Zero extended far beyond tactical bulletins. Engineers at Wright Field in Ohio, the Army Air Force's primary testing and evaluation facility, examined the captured aircraft with intense interest. They were particularly fascinated by the engine installation, the lightweight construction techniques, and the ingenious design solutions that Japanese engineers had employed to maximize performance. Some of these insights influenced American aircraft design, though the fundamental American philosophy of building robust, heavily armed fighters remained unchanged. The Zero also provided valuable insights into Japanese manufacturing capabilities and resource limitations. The extensive use of a lightweight aluminum alloy throughout the airframe indicated that Japan had access to sophisticated metallurgy, but was willing to accept reduced structural margins to save weight. The relatively simple instrument panel and lack of advanced avionics suggested either a philosophy that valued pilot skill over technology or limitations in Japan's electronics industry. The engine, while ingeniously designed, showed evidence of hand-fitting and individual adjustment of components, indicating production methods that relied more heavily on skilled labor than on precision mass manufacturing. American intelligence analysts used this information to assess Japanese industrial capacity and to predict how Japan might respond to the attrition of aircraft and pilots. Their conclusions were sobering for the Japanese. The Zero's design represented the peak of what Japanese industry could produce in 1941. It could not easily be upgraded or improved without fundamental redesign. Meanwhile, American industry was just beginning to hit its stride, producing thousands of aircraft per month with performance that improved continuously as new models entered service. Lieutenant William Leonard, whose insistence on careful recovery of the aircraft had made everything possible, received the Legion of Merit for his efforts. He continued to serve throughout the conflict, eventually retiring from the Navy with the rank of Rear Admiral. In post-war interviews, he consistently emphasized that the capture of Koga's Zero was not a matter of brilliant intelligence work, but rather a combination of Japanese bad luck and American persistence. He often reflected on the tragic irony that Tadayoshi Koga, in dying during what should have been a survivable emergency landing, had unwittingly contributed more to the Allied victory than he could possibly have achieved through any number of successful combat missions. Koga's 2 squadron mates, Shikada and Maeda, both survived the conflict. After Japan's surrender, they learned the full story of what had happened to their friend's aircraft. Maeda, in particular, was devastated by the knowledge that his decision not to destroy the Zero had contributed to Japan's defeat in the air war. In a 1963 interview with a Japanese aviation historian, Maeda stated that he had made the choice any pilot would make when faced with the possibility that a friend might still be alive. He accepted full responsibility for the consequences, but maintained that he would make the same decision again under identical circumstances. The physical aircraft, tail number A-1-154, was flown extensively throughout 1943 for demonstration purposes, allowing hundreds of American pilots to see firsthand how to fight against it effectively. By 1944, as newer Japanese fighters entered service and the Zero became less relevant to the current tactical situation, the aircraft was retired from active flying status. It was placed in storage at Naval Air Station Willow Grove in Pennsylvania, where it remained for several decades. In the 1970s, the aircraft was transferred to the National Museum of Naval Aviation in Pensacola, Florida. Restoration specialists spent years carefully preserving it, maintaining as much of the original material as possible while stabilizing the structure for long-term display. Today, it remains one of the museum's most significant artifacts, displayed with full documentation of its history and impact on the Pacific Air War. The story of Koga's Zero resonates because it demonstrates how warfare, especially modern technological warfare, turns on moments of chance and individual decisions that cascade into strategic consequences. A single damaged aircraft, an emergency landing that went wrong in precisely the right way to preserve the machine while ending the pilot's life. Two loyal friends who could not bring themselves to destroy what they believed might be a survivable crash, and a determined American intelligence officer who recognized the significance of what had been found. Any one of these elements missing, and the outcome changes entirely. For Japan, the loss of the Zero's secrets came at the worst possible time. The aircraft had provided a critical advantage during the early months of the conflict, allowing Japanese forces to achieve air superiority over vast distances despite being heavily outnumbered in total aircraft production. As long as Allied pilots believed the Zero was unbeatable in aerial combat, they fought tentatively, and Japanese pilots could leverage superior training and aircraft performance to achieve disproportionate results. But once American pilots understood that the Zero's advantages came with corresponding vulnerabilities, and more importantly, once they understood exactly how to exploit those vulnerabilities, the balance shifted irrevocably. The Zero remained a capable aircraft throughout the conflict, but it never again dominated the skies as it had in 1941 and early 1942. Later variants incorporated some improvements, including better armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, but these additions increased weight and degraded the very performance characteristics that had made the original design so effective. Meanwhile, American aircraft design evolved rapidly, each new generation specifically incorporating lessons learned from combat experience and from the detailed evaluation of captured enemy aircraft. The progression from the F-4F Wildcat to the F-6F Hellcat to the F-8F Bearcat represented continuous improvement in speed, firepower, and durability. Japanese designers, constrained by limited resources and production capacity, could not keep pace. The human dimension of the story adds another layer of complexity. Tadayoshi Koga was, by all accounts, an exceptionally skilled pilot and a decent man. He had family waiting for him in Japan, friends in his squadron, and a life he expected to continue living after the conflict ended. His death was not the result of enemy action or tactical error, but simple misfortune, the kind of accident that kills pilots even in peacetime. Yet that accident, combined with the circumstances that preserved his aircraft intact, contributed materially to the defeat of his nation's military forces. There is something profoundly unsettling about this calculus. Koga's loyalty to his country, his skill as a pilot, his decision to attempt an emergency landing rather than ditch in the ocean, all of these factors that should have increased his chances of survival instead led to his death and to consequences that worked directly against everything he had fought for. His squadron mates, acting out of friendship and hoping to save his life, made a decision that had ramifications extending far beyond anything they could have imagined in that moment, circling over Akutan Island. For the historians and analysts who have studied the Pacific Air War in the decades since, Koga's Zero stands as perhaps the single most valuable piece of intelligence captured during the entire conflict. The breaking of Japanese naval codes, the capture of Japanese strategic plans, the interrogation of prisoners, all of these contributed significantly to Allied victory. But the ability to understand and counter the aircraft that had given Japan air superiority in the early war period, to transform it from an invincible opponent into a solved problem that changed the fundamental dynamic of the air campaign. By 1945, When the conflict finally ended, Japan's naval aviation had been effectively destroyed. The experienced pilots who had made the Zero so effective in the early war were gone, lost in countless engagements where American numerical superiority and increasingly effective tactics ground down Japanese forces through sheer attrition. The newer pilots rushed through abbreviated training programs, flew Zeros and other Japanese fighters into combat, with insufficient skills to exploit their aircraft's remaining advantages while being acutely vulnerable to the weaknesses that American pilots had learned to target ruthlessly. The industrial picture was equally bleak. American factories produced over 100,000 military aircraft in 1944 alone. Japanese production for the entire year was less than 25,000 aircraft across all types. The quality gap had widened as well. American aircraft rolling off production lines in late 1944 incorporated advanced features like radar, improved engines, and sophisticated fire control systems. Japanese aircraft were increasingly built with substitute materials as resource shortages bit deeper, their performance degrading as the industrial base struggled to maintain output under constant aerial bombardment. In this larger context, one might argue that Koga's Zero simply accelerated trends that were already inevitable. American industrial superiority, the unsustainable attrition rate of Japanese pilots, the growing skill of American aviators, all of these factors would eventually have overcome Japanese air forces, regardless of whether one intact Zero fell into American hands. This argument has merit, but underestimates the importance of timing in warfare. The tactical revolution that followed the evaluation of Koga's Zero came at a critical moment, when Japan still possessed significant veteran pilot strength and when the outcome of the Pacific conflict remained uncertain. By giving American pilots specific tested methods for countering the Zero 18 months earlier than they might otherwise have developed them through trial and error in combat, the captured aircraft compressed the learning curve dramatically. Each American pilot who survived an engagement because he knew not to turn fight with a Zero, who used the correct escape maneuver, who targeted the aircraft's vulnerable fuel system, represented a victory that built American strength while depleting irreplaceable Japanese resources. The mathematical impact, when calculated across thousands of aerial engagements over 3 years, was substantial. If the captured Zero improved American kill ratios by even 20%, which is conservative given the documented improvement in results following distribution of the tactical bulletin, the cumulative effect would be measured in hundreds of Japanese aircraft and pilots who were lost earlier than they would have been otherwise, and hundreds of American aircraft and pilots who survived when they might have been lost. This kind of analysis reduces human beings to statistics, which is both necessary for understanding large-scale conflict and deeply uncomfortable when considering individual lives. Tadayoshi Koga was not a statistic. He was a 24-year-old man whose life ended in a marsh on a remote island. His death was witnessed by friends who could do nothing to help him and whose decision not to destroy his aircraft would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The American pilots who learned to defeat the Zero using knowledge gained from his aircraft were also individuals. Young men fighting in a conflict not of their choosing, trying to survive and return home. The story resists simple moral interpretation. There are no villains here, only people caught in circumstances beyond their control, making decisions based on incomplete information and immediate pressures. The tragedy is not that Koga died, though that is certainly tragic for him and his loved ones. The tragedy is that the entire conflict occurred, that millions of people died in a war that accomplished nothing, that could not have been achieved through negotiation and compromise, that young men like Koga and Sanders and Leonard had their lives consumed by violence regardless of whether they physically survived. Yet within that larger tragedy, there are moments of human decency that deserve recognition. The American recovery team that buried Koga with military honors, Shikada and Maeda, refusing to fire on what they believed might be their injured friend. Leonard's insistence on treating the enemy pilot's remains with respect, despite objections. These small gestures of humanity, while they did not change the outcome of battles or alter strategic calculations, represented a refusal to allow war to completely erase moral considerations. The technical legacy of Koga's Zero extended well beyond the immediate tactical applications. The aircraft influenced American design philosophy in subtle but important ways. The recognition that an aircraft optimized for a single performance parameter, in the Zero's case maneuverability, necessarily made compromises in other areas, shaped thinking about fighter design for decades. The ideal fighter, American designers concluded, needed to be balanced. It should be fast enough to control engagement, maneuverable enough to survive when combat was joined, tough enough to bring its pilot home despite battle damage, and powerful enough to ensure that brief firing opportunities were sufficient to destroy an opponent. This philosophy, born partly from the detailed analysis of Koga's Zero, produced the aircraft that dominated the jet age. The F-86 Sabre, which achieved remarkable success in Korea, reflected these principles. So did the F-4 Phantom, the F-15 Eagle, and every successful American fighter since. The lessons learned from a single captured Zero in 1942 echoed through generations of aircraft design. For the Japanese aviation industry, the loss of the Zero's secrets came to symbolize the larger failure of strategic planning that characterized Japan's approach to the conflict. The decision to launch aggressive military action against the United States while lacking the industrial capacity to sustain a prolonged conflict represented a catastrophic miscalculation. The Zero itself embodied this miscalculation. It was a brilliant tactical solution that assumed wars were decided by superior skill and aircraft performance in individual engagements. But modern industrial warfare is decided by production capacity, resource availability, and the ability to replace losses. Japan could produce excellent aircraft and train superb pilots, but it could not do so in numbers sufficient to offset American advantages in these areas. The story of Tadayoshi Koga and his Zero ends, as all stories from that conflict must end, with reflection on what was lost and what was learned. The aircraft preserved in Pensacola stands as a monument not to Japanese defeat or American victory, but to the enormous cost of modern warfare and to the thin line between chance and consequence that determines how conflicts unfold. A slightly different angle of approach, a landing gear that held for just a few seconds longer, and Koga might have walked away from his emergency landing. His squadron mates might have recovered him, his aircraft might have been destroyed as protocol required, and the course of the Pacific Air War might have followed a subtly different path. Instead, a combination of circumstances that no one could have predicted or controlled created a moment of enormous historical significance. That moment, born from tragedy and accident, changed how Americans fought in the air for the remainder of the conflict. It provided knowledge that saved lives on one side and cost lives on the other. It demonstrated both the crucial importance of intelligence in modern warfare and the simple truth that sometimes the most valuable intelligence comes not from clever operations or careful planning, but from fortune and persistence. The young Japanese pilot who died in a marsh on Akutan Island could not have known that his final flight would have consequences extending far beyond his own death. His loyalty was to his squadron, his nation, and his own survival. The aircraft he flew represented the peak of Japanese naval aviation technology, a machine designed to give skilled pilots an almost insurmountable advantage in aerial combat. Neither he nor his commanders could have anticipated that this very aircraft, preserved intact through a combination of circumstances none of them could control, would become the key to unraveling Japanese air superiority across the entire Pacific theater. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.